this has been a long process of collecting data because we couldn't find any existing database where we could study these ecological restoration-focused tree planting projects. Because these are different from monocultures, for example, and for example, the FAO has some statistics, broad statistics, unreliable statistics on the planted forest category, but that's different from, you know, having these tree planting initiatives, which are typically smaller scale and happening all around. And there have been a lot of pledges of planting, like 100 trees or 1 billion trees or even more, many organizations, and we wanted to know what's happening in this field. We have had many research assistants doing valuable work, and this is like mostly quantitative analysis, but also qualitative. So it's based on, I have done field research in Brazil, especially in the Amazon, and then getting some insights from that field research in different places on what we have to look for, and then going through also the literature, and then looking at the parameters we should look at. So there are some of the variables we are including, and maybe Sophia, you can go through the next slides.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this database has been interesting. We were chit-chatting last night with Amber Huff, where we're going to hear from next, and she said that she's also been doing some critical databasing, and we were exchanging some feelings on it because it's really hard to build a database like this because the information is so disparate. And as you can see, we had a lot of different variables that we were looking at in this database. So it was like a lot of information gathering, and it's kind of one of those things where it feels like we've done so much, but at the same time, I'm like, oh my God, what does it actually say? Because there's so much there. It's so rich. As Markus mentioned, we've had a big team that's helped us in this data collection. So we had a first wave of data collection in 2024, and with that we gathered about 800 cases, and that was kind of where we cut our teeth. This is the first time we've ever assembled this type of database, so it was there was a learning curve. Are we allowed to say that? There was a learning curve in doing this, especially with defining the parameters that we wanted with these tree planting schemes, because one of the things that we really discovered as soon as we started to get into it is it's really difficult to actually find concrete information on a lot of these projects. It was almost like the more we looked at a project, the more we were like, wait, what are they doing? And you'd think that it would be the other way. It would be, you know, the more you look at a project, the more we find out about the project. But as we tried to really dig down in some of the levels, figuring out who the players were in these projects, it really got us into like this constellation of figuring out that this is actually like a business, to make a long story short. So that was our first data collection period. And then in our second data collection period in 2025, we were a little bit more solid with the way that we were approaching getting these cases into the database, and we were able to add almost another 800 cases to the database in 2025. We were super lucky to be joined by Tina, who has done our initial statistical analysis. Amazing. Definitely very grateful for that. And then we've done some continued analysis working with one of our colleagues from Barcelona, Ksenia. And then Markus and I have really been working on the oversight and the qualitative analysis of the data. There's quantitative analysis that we're doing, but with that, we're also doing more qualitative work with it. And here's just a little, okay, this is going to be a jump scare picture, okay? So what we have on the right-hand side is these are examples of the actual project websites. We've all looked at project websites before, and what we were doing was going through those project websites with a fine-tooth comb and turning them into bringing them into categorizations. So there's a sorry, it makes me feel a little anxious every time I look at it. But like I said, we had Dina come in and start to do some of that initial empirical analysis and coding, and they were able to help us get into much more manageably understandable data. So this is a little sneak peek of when we started to bring them into categories. what things looked like. And as you can see, we have both red, yellow, and green there. One of the things that we discovered is some of the information that you would imagine would be very readily available. For example, the funder, right? But some of them just didn't have the information. So for example, some of our categories here, only 6% of the websites had that particular piece of information on them. Or some of them were really good, like 96%, but some of them, like I said, were down under 30%, which was like really surprising to us. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at, is not only what information is there, but also what information is missing.
So here are some of the project locations where they are based. So actually, the way we approach this is to look at the projects. Some earlier studies have focused on like actors. They took like 100 major planting actors, mostly in the US and Europe. And then they couldn't tell where these projects are, for example. So what we can do with this data is we can locate it in particular places, like we have even the coordinates if that's mentioned. So that allows for going to the field in the future if that's possible, to check what's actually happening there for verification purposes. So we found out that the highest number of cases were in India, and they were reporting those like as separate projects.
Can I make one quick? I have something to add here. It's actually important. One thing that I want to add is, because we were using the website data, and this is probably one of the reasons why in this particular data collection, India shows is so high, is because different organizations took different tactics in how they displayed data on their websites. And since we were using the websites as our prime, like that was our data source, we kind of had to go along with how projects were choosing to represent themselves. So some projects would have a separate web page for each individual planting activity that they were doing, whereas other projects conflated huge amounts of individual projects into, quote, a single website, which means that that's part of the reason. Anyway.
Which takes us into the crucial question of any research of what is this a case of? What can this data tell us about? First, we were thinking about that we would provide like a more general understanding of what's happening in this setting globally, in the global south. But then we figured out that there's actually a lot of tree planting happening outside these projects in English language web pages. So a lot of local people are just planting trees. There are a lot of social movements planting trees. There are a lot of state actors not talking in projects about these trees. For example, the earlier studies show that China has planted most trees like during the past decades, but we didn't really find so many English language web pages about projects in China. So actually, it does not diminish the value of this database, because what we can say is that we have a good analysis on these new markets, on these global international markets for the ecological restoration-based tree planting projects, which market themselves through these web pages with different actors, because they're English language, so they are geared towards the international audience mostly. And there are a lot of money involved, of course, in this, and so it's important to know what's happening there, which might be the best practices if they are followed and so on, so that the donor money is not used wantonly or inefficiently. So we are looking, for example, the number of trees, how many were there across all the projects. So it was mostly between 100,000 and 1 million, or between 10,000 and 100,000 trees. Of course, then we later divided this by the hectares and so on, and went into more fine-grained analysis. And then we have long, text excerpts from the websites, so we can do more detailed analysis of, for example, what is being planted. So these are some of the trees mentioned and the plants mentioned in the websites, and what are most common denominators used. And then we were interested in seeing the boom cycle, and we really found out that this has really boomed since 2015. And the peak seemed to be around 2021, 2022. It has come a little bit down, but it's still continuing. And the ending year is here. So there were quite a few projects that had already ended by 2022, but they still had their web pages on. And we did a more fine-grained analysis later on, or actually we are doing that now, on what is the difference, for example, between corporate planting actor, NGO planting actor, and then a corporate NGO alliance. Those were the three most common categories. Governments and social movements and others, they were not so represented in this category. And we found that like corporate projects, many of them had ended, but they still had web pages, while the NGO projects, after the projects had ended, they mostly took out the web pages. So, yeah.
And one database method thing that we did with that, because that's one other problem with web pages is they can be edited at any time, and who's editing them, I don't know, and also being taken away. But one of the things that we did is with every website that we collected data from, at the moment of data collection, we captured an offline version of that website. So we have an offline repository of every web page that we collected data from. Which is kind of cool, because then we can go back, and that also will give us the chance, if we're able to take this into a more longitudinal study, we can go back and see, like we have our own Wayback Machine, if you will. So we can go back and see what was on those project web pages at the time of data collection. And then, for example, if we went back today, then we can see how they've changed.
Yeah. We also had like several interns and research assistants, and are already having like one from Colombia, looking at Colombia and Brazil cases more in detail. And what they found out is that, for example, Mayra, she found out that the same project can have multiple web pages in Spanish and English language, and it can have different names, the exactly same project. So it can be used for many purposes by different actors involved. So here are the involvement of planting actors. So NGOs were important, corporate, others, and then the government. And I can tell more about the more detailed findings here. So about the growing area, so what we found out is that you really need to separate the earlier data we showed by the different categories, because there are major differences between how corporations and NGOs and corporate NGO alliances, their figures. So the growing area is like that the NGO medium was like 1,500 hectares, while for corporations it was only about 60 hectares. So there's a major difference there. And for corporate and NGO alliance, about 140 hectares medium. So what does this tell if NGOs have a much larger area? And in general, we found that it's much more useful or fruitful to look at the hectare area, the size in hectares, than the number of trees. Typically, there's like this kind of fetishism on the number of trees, but that does not tell much. The hectares involved tells much more. Firstly, because, for example, in a mangrove area, in a particular biome, you plant much less trees than in a high density area or in a particular method of planting in a particular biome. So it really matters more to look at the size. And But based on this, we would incur that NGO projects are more aiming to, more higher impact projects, larger projects, while the corporate projects might be more about showcasing something, like doing a small projects and then having a web page about that. Yeah, and then the duration. So the corporate projects had the duration of average of just 1 year, while the NGOs had like over 7 years. And this is really important because 1 year is far too short for tree planting projects. And here we also look at the follow-up reporting. So most projects did not have follow-up reporting, which should be there. And we are now doing this regression, looking at the country level statistics, more like a regression analysis. But yeah, so here are some preliminary findings.
Yeah, so we did find, I don't know if, I'm sure some people in this room know that one of the interests of our research team generally is multi-species and other than human actors and their role in the space. And we did find that most of the projects in our database did report taking a multi-species approach directly on their website, which was very interesting. Many of the projects, as Markus said, were carried out by either these corporations or the corporate NGO alliances. That there has been this marked rise since 2015. We're thinking probably because of the Paris Agreement. There's been a shift toward assisted natural regeneration, which is something that's interesting because that was called for quite strongly in the literature around tree planting in the 2010s. We identified a severe, and I talked about this a little already, but we identified a severe lack of information, for example, on the exact locations of the planting initiatives on the ground. Some of them went all the way down to coordinate level, but there were a surprising number of projects that just said multiple countries. We're planting trees in multiple countries. It's like, well, what countries? Like, that doesn't help us. And that we're saying here that that does hinder field research possibilities. But once again, when you're looking at the entirety of the database, there's like rich possibilities for further research. But then there's also this kind of surprising, like, why aren't you even saying what country you're planting in? The research definitely needs to be expanded, especially in the global south, including a more concerted focus on the details of the technical aspects of the project. For example, socioeconomic factors and longer-term observation, really. We were very surprised about the lack of follow-up reporting in most of the projects. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't happening, but they aren't talking about it publicly. And so we actually had a master's student who did her whole master's thesis on this exact question. So an important first step, as we all know, in project development is really establishing what the local communities want, need, and expect when participating in these tree planting projects. And that was also largely missing from these kind of media materials about tree planting. So yeah, thank you. And now I get to do my double role. So I've got two hats on. I was just part of the presentation, but I'm also going to facilitate a little question session. We have a few minutes to, if you have any questions, either about the project in general, Maria's opening, or the information that we just gave about our data collection process. This is definitely the time. If you are with us online, like I said, there's two options for you. You can either write your question in the chat and we can read it out on your behalf, or we can open your microphone up. So does anybody have any questions?
Björn Sundell, I did my research long ago in the 1980s, and I was surprised when I looked at your map that there seemed to be very few projects in North Africa. There must be a huge need for tree planting in semi-arid areas. Is this because you haven't found projects there, or is it because there are not enough projects?
Well, I mean, that might be a shift. Like there was a lot of in Eastern Africa. We really didn't find those. I mean, that's also the language, there might be French. So we are covering English language web pages, but still, if they would want to have funds from the international audience, like, I don't know, they didn't figure out. I mean, we covered all the major existing databases and everything else. So
yeah, so in constructing our database in the 2014, we've been working on this forever. Now, in the 2024 data collection, we got the ball rolling in kind of a snowball sampling method. So we used search terms and basically Googled and saw what came back to us with search terms like ecological restoration plus tree planting plus development. So, really working around search terms. But then in our 2025 data collection, as Markus said, we took we'd found other databases in the process of doing our data collection, and we kept a list of those. And then in our 2025 collection, we went through each of those databases, figured out which of our projects were represented there, which weren't, and then added the projects that were not already represented into our database.
They are labeled like afforestation, then they might not be here.
Okay, well,
because we didn't use that as
we did not use that as a search term.
We are not looking at afforestation, but restoration.
Can I add, in those countries also the lack of, it could be that they are doing water restoration in some form, and that trees are not the first thing that forest will come. I know in Saudi Arabia there's been some kind of like the digging of this kind of to capture the water first.
Oh, thank you. It was very interesting. I was wondering that when you said that these web pages they contain kind of marketing speech or marketing concepts, do you think there is some kind of influence that there's kind of information missing? So do you think that it influences on public opinion or our scientific analysis, or are people kind of able to read through what is missing? What do you have? How do you find it?
I mean, I have ideas on that. Well, I personally think that this really, like a lot of the goals that organizations were putting forward, like they did end up many times being quite formulaic, like trying to tap into like these emotional, give us money so we can plant more trees. So there was a lot of like spectacle within these web pages, and it really tapped into kind of that emotional pull. So there was a lot of strong language used in terms of ecological crisis, polycrisis, biodiversity crisis, and that doesn't mean that isn't real. Like that is real, but it's it makes you wonder really like what is the actual situation on the ground. And I think that sometimes with the web pages, having looked at thousands, you know, they're usually very pretty. Like they're very pretty. They use pictures. They have pictures of people planting trees, and it looks like really cool and like, wow, they must be having so much fun. But there's a lot of things that obscures. And I think that's come out a lot in some of the work that's been done in the other work packages of the overarching project. Like, for example, some of the labor invisibilities of tree planting as a practice. And then also, I think that with the tree planting in particular, it really taps into, you know, there's this kind of overarching societal trees are good. Trees are good always. It's always good to plant a tree. And so we think that the websites and the marketing materials for these tree planting projects do tend to kind of fall back onto that assumption and use that to their advantage, that, oh, look, we're planting trees. And this goes along with what Markus was saying about this fetishization of the number of trees planted, because it's like the number of trees planted really doesn't, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, you know, the number of trees planted doesn't really actually reflect anything about the actual worth of the project.
Yeah, so to check the, you know, veracity of the claims, I, for example, divided then the number of trees with the hectares to see like if it's like average amount of trees planted per hectare, if that is correct more or less for that biome and that type of planting. If it was something weird, then we looked more in detail, like what's happening here.
It would be interesting to know that do you have in your database about the actors like the NGOs and corporates and so on, how many of those were planting trees, if we are talking now about the planting trees in their own country, how much they were coming from outside?
Yeah, so
Not many.
yeah, that's very interesting because typically it's like a lot of actors involved. So you have like these different corporate actors. On the one hand, you have entities like Mastercard, which is then partnered with Conservation International, and they have projects in many countries, in Brazil, Colombia, whatever. And then you have like then you have these kind of platform corporations like Ecosia, and they have their projects, and they have like local NGO partners, even social movements sometimes. So there's like a chain. And then if you have like an NGO involved, they typically provide more like the technical expertise, local NGO on what to plant. So it comes from elsewhere, but it's a very varied group.
What publications do you have? Like the presentation said many things, so like how to cite you. Like have you?
Well, we can cite it like this presentation today in this room here. There's not yet any publication of this. Yeah.
Publication, yes.
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm noticing in the map that most of the projects are in the global south. Is it because you focus on the south, or is it because, or if you have any comparative between European, because you have some England and Finland, but not other.
Yeah, that's because the funding was for global south, so we focused on global south,
Okay.
which is actually much more difficult we could have done it globally because I think now some people are saying we should have it globally. It would have been much easier.
We had a few cases that kind of snuck in that came from other areas. We have
Multiple country.
yeah. And since this map has been produced, we've actually gone through another iteration of cleaning the data. But this is the one that I had pretty to put in the presentation today. But our analysis that's going into our forthcoming paper actually excludes the very few cases from global north.
About the sizes, so one just comment on these mangroves. It's quite a special thing that normally the land, actually the hectares is very small as well, because there's only very restricted areas that you can plant there. So that's something. But about the, did you notice something that if there's landscape restoration mentioned or something like that, the area is bigger than like in average, or did you do that kind of thing?
That's a good
We
question.
can do that. I think we haven't done that.
We haven't, no. Last question.
I just,
Oh, yeah.
No, one.
Yeah.
Just, you know, the United Nations has decided that 2021-2030 is the UN decade on restoration. And therefore, there was also quite a number of effort from the United Nations and different office. Were you able to account for it? I know it's a bit complicated because usually when they reforest, they do also other activities. They do food protection, governance is a bit more complicated, but I would be quite interested about this because it's a
Yeah, it really came out when we separated by actor category, because then the NGO category had more typical NGO was 2030. So it seemed that the NGOs had really like focused on like on that UN restoration decade. Yeah.